Calvin Reeves was 41 years old when his wife of 13 years served him divorce papers across the breakfast table and laughed while she did it. Not a cruel laugh, exactly. That was what stayed with him afterward. It was not even cruel. It was the laugh of someone who has already won something and cannot quite keep the satisfaction off their face. She slid the envelope across the table while he was pouring coffee, and she said, with that particular quality of lightness that is worse than contempt, "It's finally done. Don't make this difficult." And then she laughed. A small, bright, utterly certain sound. Calvin Reeves set the coffee pot down. He had spent 13 years as a commercial real estate attorney who had, 7 years into the marriage, stopped practicing law to manage what he had been quietly building for a decade. A 14-property portfolio held inside a family trust that bore his grandmother's name, generating net annual income his wife had never once asked about, because she had already decided, somewhere in year 3 of the marriage, that she knew exactly what Calvin was and what he was worth. He drove a 2016 Honda Accord with a cracked dashboard panel he had never replaced. He bought his suits off the rack and had them tailored. He packed his own lunch. Her friends called him Practical Calvin, and she had never once corrected them. She had no idea that the attorney who was about to represent him had drafted the trust documents himself, that the trust held $28 million in commercial assets she had never thought to look for, or that her boyfriend, the man she intended to start her new life with, had, 3 months ago, taken out a personal loan to buy a car he was about to lose. What Calvin set in motion the day those papers landed on his kitchen table, Diane would not recover from. Before we jump into the story, comment where in the world you are watching from and subscribe, because tomorrow's story is one you need to hear. The alarm went off at 5:47 a.m. Calvin reached for it without opening his eyes, found it on the second reach, and silenced it. He lay still for a moment in the gray pre-dawn and ran through the day the way he had always run through his days, methodically, in order, from the first task to the last. Property management call at 8:00. Site walk on the Brookhaven building at 10:30. Lunch with his accountant, Robert Fitch, at noon. Ava's piano recital at 6:30. He swung his legs over the side of the bed. The bedroom of the house in Buckhead was large and quiet, and had been decorated in Diane's taste. Pale gray walls, linen everything. Furniture that looked expensive, because it was. Calvin had not chosen a single piece of it. He had written the checks for it. He had understood that this was his role in the aesthetic of the house. He was the mechanism that funded the environment that Diane curated. He had told himself, for years, that this was a reasonable arrangement. People divided things differently. He built the structure. She decorated the rooms. He went downstairs in the dark and made coffee in the kitchen, which was white marble and professional-grade appliances, and a layout that Diane had redesigned twice in 13 years. He stood at the counter drinking the first cup and looking through the window at the backyard, a half-acre that backed up to a tree line, a patio he had poured himself the summer before Ava was born, a garden that Diane had started and abandoned, and that he had continued maintaining because the girl next door had grown up watching him water it and had started asking questions about plants. He poured the coffee into his thermos, a blue Stanley that was 7 years old and had a dent in the side from a job site visit where a 2x4 had rolled off a stack, and went upstairs to check on Ava. She was 11. She was asleep on her stomach with one arm hanging over the edge of the mattress and her hair in the state that it always reached by morning, complicated beyond prediction. He stood in the doorway long enough to confirm the breathing and the arm. And then he went down the hall to his office. The office was the one room in the house that was entirely his. Dark wood desk he had bought used from an estate sale and refinished himself. Bookshelves floor to ceiling on 2 walls. Law books and property management texts, and 3 full shelves of history that he read on Sunday mornings. A single framed photograph on the desk. Him and Ava at a lake in North Carolina the previous summer. Both of them in life jackets, squinting into the sun. He sat at the desk and opened the property management software and reviewed the overnight reports for the portfolio. He had started with 1 building. It was not a glamorous beginning. He had been 26, 2 years into his associate position at a real estate law firm in Atlanta, when his grandmother died and left him what she had described in the will as the little building on Chamblee Tucker Road. The little building was a 6,400 square foot mixed-use property, fully leased, generating $8,400 per month in net rent. He had driven to see it the week after the funeral, stood in the parking lot in a suit that was too hot for August in Atlanta, and understood something that he had not known how to articulate at the time, but that had since become the foundational principle of everything he did. The building did not know who owned it. The building just produced. He had not sold it. He had placed it inside a newly formed revocable trust, the Meredith Ann Reeves Trust, named for his grandmother, and he had used the income to buy a second building, then a third. He had done this while practicing law, and then after year 7, when the trust income exceeded his salary by a factor that made the daily commute feel like theater, he had told his firm he was reducing to part-time consulting status and had not elaborated on why. Diane had known he left the firm. She understood he was managing properties. She had never asked how many, had never asked to see the trust documents, had never once sat in the office with him on a Sunday morning and asked what the overnight report said. She had a general sense that there were some rental properties. She had calibrated her opinion of what that meant using the Honda Accord and the off-the-rack suits and the packed lunches and practical Calvin, and everything had matched up in a way that satisfied her. She had been constructing a picture for 13 years. She had never once thought to check if it was real. Calvin reviewed the overnight reports, made 2 notes, and closed the laptop at 6:30. He went downstairs and started breakfast. Eggs and toast for Ava. Coffee refilled for himself, and was sliding eggs onto a plate when he heard her on the stairs, navigating her hair situation with the focused expression she wore every morning while confronting the same problem she had been confronting since she was 5. "How bad?" he asked. She sat at the island and looked at him. "Moderate. Rubber bands in the drawer." She found it and began the work, and he put the plate in front of her. And she ate, and told him about a problem she was having with a piece in the piano recital. A chord transition in the second movement that her hands were not cooperating with. She demonstrated it in the air above the counter, fingers moving against the invisible keys, and he watched her figure out what her hands were doing wrong while she talked through it. "Slow it down," he said. "Do it at half speed until both hands know where they're going. Then speed it up." She looked at him. "That's what Miss Patterson said." "Miss Patterson's right. You could have just said that." "Miss Patterson earned her degree," he said. "Trust the source." She finished her eggs. He dropped her at school at 7:45 and drove to his office, a small suite on the 4th floor of a building on Peachtree Road that he had leased from himself for 4 years, a detail that still occasionally struck him as funny, and got on the 8:00 call with his property manager, a man named Leon, who ran the day-to-day operations on 8 of the 14 properties with a competence that Calvin trusted completely and compensated accordingly. He had noticed the first signs 14 months ago. Not the signs, exactly, the quality. A stillness in Diane that was new. She had always been deliberate, controlled, socially precise. But this was different. She moved through the house with the particular ease of someone who has made a decision and has not yet had to live with its consequences. She was lighter. She was also, more often than not, somewhere else. She worked in pharmaceutical sales, had for 9 years a company that covered the Southeast Corridor. She traveled regularly. He had never questioned the travel. He questioned it now, not aloud, but in the way he questioned a load-bearing wall that had been in place for years and had begun, almost imperceptibly, to shift. There was a man named Gregory Alston. He did not know the name yet at 14 months. He knew there was someone. He knew the way he knew a structural problem before he could name it. Not from evidence, but from the change in load distribution, the way the weight was moving through the system differently. 6 months ago, he had known the name. Gregory Alston was a pharmaceutical rep at Diane's company, 11 years younger than Calvin. And from what Calvin had been able to determine through a quiet evening of public records searches and LinkedIn review, he was the kind of man who made his income visible in the way Calvin had never bothered to do. A leased BMW, a Buckhead apartment, a wardrobe that communicated ambition more clearly than his salary supported. He had been at the company for 3 years. He had been in Diane's sales territory for 2. Calvin had sat with the information for 6 months and done nothing with it. He had been, and this is in all things, methodical. He was not ready to move. He needed to understand the full structure of what was happening before he touched any part of it. The morning of the divorce papers, he had been ready for 2 weeks. He simply had not yet decided on the exact timing. Diane resolved that by sliding the envelope across the marble counter. He had set the coffee pot down. He had looked at her, composed, certain, a small smile still on her face that was the residue of the laugh. And he had picked up the envelope, opened it, and read the first 2 pages with the calm focus he brought to any legal document. She said, "I've been generous with the assets split. The house, obviously, will sell and divide your rental properties. My attorney expects we'll argue over the portfolio appreciation, but there's a path. And I want you to know this isn't. I'll need a few days to review this," Calvin said. "Of course," she said. "There's no rush." He folded the papers along their original crease, replaced them in the envelope, and set the envelope on the counter. He picked up his thermos. He said, "Drive Ava to school this morning. I have an early call." He walked out through the garage. He sat in the Honda Accord in the driveway for a moment, looking at the back fence line, at the tree line beyond it. He had poured that patio himself. He had maintained that garden for 7 years. He felt the weight of it. He allowed that for exactly as long as it served him. Then he picked up his phone and called Raymond Cho. Raymond Cho had been Calvin's law school roommate at Emory and was now the managing partner of a boutique litigation firm in Midtown that handled, among other things, complex asset disputes and high-net-worth matrimonial cases. He had helped Calvin structure the Meredith Ann Reeves Trust in 2017. He knew every document in it because he had drafted several of them. He answered on the second ring. Calvin said, "Diane filed this morning." Raymond said, "I'll clear my afternoon. Come at 2. Calvin's brother Marcus, not related to a different Marcus, just what his mother had named her second son, called that evening after Calvin had told him. "I'm driving to Atlanta right now," Marcus said. "No, you're not." "Calvin." She laughed. She laughed. "I'm coming. Stay where you are. I need you to do 2 things. Pick up Ava from the recital tonight. If I'm not back in time, I'll let the school know. And don't mention this to Mama until I've had a chance to think about what I'm telling her." There was silence on Marcus's end. Calvin could hear him pacing. Marcus was a man who processed things through his feet. "Tell me there's something you can do," Marcus said. "There's a great deal I can do," Calvin said. "You're so calm it's terrifying." "Terrified doesn't help Ava," Calvin said. "And it doesn't help me. I'll call you tomorrow." He sat in the parking structure across from the piano recital venue and waited. He had made the recital with 12 minutes to spare. He had sat in the second row and watched Ava navigate the chord transition in the second movement. She had slowed it down, exactly as he suggested, and her hands had moved through it cleanly, and she had looked up from the keys at him afterward with an expression that he would keep somewhere quiet and unreachable. He had driven her home and put her to bed and helped with the hair situation and answered her questions about the recital and told her she had played beautifully and meant it. He had not told her anything about the morning. She was 11. She knew something had shifted in the house. Children always knew. But the knowing did not require naming yet, and he was not going to name it until he had to. He went to the office in the house after she was asleep and sat at the dark wood desk under the ceiling he had not designed and the shelves he had built himself, and opened the Meredith Ann Reeves trust folder on his desktop. 14 properties, 3 of which had been acquired since the marriage, using capital that was traceable through documented distributions to premarital trust assets. The trust itself predated the marriage by 4 years. The Chambly Tucker building, his grandmother's building, the first one, had been placed in the trust in 2009. Calvin and Diane had married in 2011. The question of whether the portfolio appreciation during the marriage constituted marital property was the question Diane's attorney was planning to argue. Raymond Cho was planning to argue something else entirely. He met Raymond at 2:00 the following afternoon, and they sat in Raymond's conference room with the trust documents laid flat on the table between them, and Raymond went through the structure the way he always went through documents, without speaking, with his reading glasses on, his pen moving in small notations along the margins. After 20 minutes, Raymond took off his glasses. "The trust was established before the marriage," he said. "The funding instrument was your grandmother's building. Every subsequent acquisition is documented as a trust asset reinvestment. The income from the original asset was used to fund the second acquisition. The income from the first 2 funded the third, and so on. This is a closed loop. The trust never received marital funds." "Correct," Calvin said. "Diane never contributed to the trust. No, her income was deposited into joint operating accounts. Household expenses, the mortgage on the Buckhead house, Ava's school." "Correct. She signed a quitclaim for the Chambly Tucker property when you restructured the trust in 2017. "She did." Calvin slid a document across the table. "She also signed annual trust accountings for 7 consecutive years, acknowledging receipt of the summary. Raymond's firm had prepared those documents. She signed them. She never asked what was in them." Raymond held the document at arm's length and looked at it for a moment. "Calvin, yes, in 20 years of matrimonial work, I have never seen a cleaner line between marital and separate property." He set the document down. "Her attorney is going to argue beneficial marital interest. They will claim that because you managed the trust as a secondary occupation during the marriage, and because the trust income supplemented the household economy, she is entitled to equitable distribution of portfolio growth. What do you say to that?" "I say the trust distributions to the household were documented as loans from the trust to the marital estate, which the household repaid annually." He looked at Calvin. "Were they?" "Pages 44 through 91 of the trust folder," Calvin said. 13 years of loan ledgers, repayment records, and interest calculations, prepared annually by Robert Fitch and reviewed by your firm." Raymond was quiet for a moment. The afternoon light came through the west windows of the conference room and lay flat across the table. "She doesn't know about the loan ledgers," Raymond said. "She signed the household financial summary every April, Calvin said. She didn't read them. Raymond Cho looked at Calvin Reeves across the conference table for a long moment, with an expression that was not quite surprise and not quite admiration. It was the expression of a lawyer who has just seen a structure that was built before anyone thought to question it. "She laughed?" he said. "She laughed," Calvin said. Raymond put his glasses back on. "Then, let's get to work." The forensic accounting engagement began that week. Raymond retained an analyst named Sheila Park, who had spent 11 years in the IRS before moving into private practice, and who approached financial documentation with the systematic thoroughness of someone who had once found a hidden account in a man's deceased dog's name. She received the trust documents, the loan ledgers, the annual accountings, and 14 property files, and she began. What she found, in the course of her initial review, was something Calvin had not flagged, but that Sheila identified in the second week. Diane had, over the past 8 months, made 8 cash withdrawals from their joint savings account, totaling $34,200. The withdrawals were structured to avoid triggering automatic bank alerts, each one under the reporting threshold. They had been made at 3 different branch locations on days when Diane was ostensibly traveling for work. Sheila documented all of it and forwarded the summary to Raymond. Raymond filed a formal asset preservation motion in Fulton County Family Court within 48 hours. All joint accounts were frozen. The motion cited the withdrawal pattern and attached Sheila's documentation. Diane's attorney called Raymond's office the same afternoon the motion was served. Diane called Calvin. He answered this time. "You froze the accounts," she said. Raymond filed a motion. The judge granted it. "Calvin, that is completely unnecessary. We are adults." "We can handle this." Sheila Park found 8 withdrawals totaling $34,200, Calvin said. They were made in a pattern designed to avoid bank notification thresholds. Raymond thought it was worth documenting. "Silence, Raymond," she said. "Raymond Cho," Calvin said. "He's representing me. He drafted the trust documents in 2017. He's familiar with the full portfolio structure." The silence on her end had a specific quality. Not anger. Something more careful than anger. The quality of someone who has received information and is recalibrating the distance between where they thought they were and where they actually are. "I see," she said. "I'll let Raymond handle the communications from here," Calvin said. "How's Ava?" Another pause. "She's fine. She's at school." "Good," he said. "Good." He hung up. Gregory Alston, by this point, had begun to understand that he was not in the position he had believed himself to be in. He had been, for the past 8 months, operating under the premise that Diane Reeves was a woman of independent financial means in the process of exiting a marriage to a man of modest income, and that the emerging arrangement would benefit from Diane's freedom and resources in ways that were mutually advantageous. He had been updated on the trust by Diane in a phone call on the night the asset preservation motion was filed. He had asked how much the trust was worth. She had told him she didn't know the full amount. Her attorney was working on getting the disclosure documents. He had asked what it might be. She had said, "I'm not sure." "More than I expected." He had asked, "How much more?" She had said, "I don't want to talk about it tonight." She had not called him back that week. He had driven his leased BMW to her apartment. She had moved into a short-term furnished rental in Midtown after the papers were served, on a Thursday evening to discuss the situation. She had not answered the door. She had texted him 40 minutes later, "I need some space. Give me a few days." He had sat in the parking lot of her building in the leased BMW for 17 minutes, and then driven home. He would later reflect that the moment of maximum confidence, parking the car in the Buckhead driveway, watching Diane smile at him across the yard, understanding that the obstacle was being removed cleanly and efficiently, had been the moment of maximum error. He had assessed the situation from one set of documents. He had not known there were other documents. He had not known about a woman named Meredith Ann Reeves and a building on Chamblee Tucker Road and 14 years of quiet accumulation. He would not know all of it until the financial disclosure was filed with the court. He read about it in a summary his own attorney, he had engaged one at this point, for reasons relating to the $34,200 withdrawal investigation, which had touched his name in one of Sheila Park's footnotes, had forwarded him. He did not call Diane after that. The asset disclosure was filed with the Fulton County Family Court in November and ran to 53 pages. Total trust assets, 14 properties, current appraised value of $28.4 million. Net annual income from the portfolio, $1.9 million. Trust established, 2009. Funding instrument, the Meredith Ann Reeves Trust. Marital contribution to trust, 0. Documented loan repayments from marital estate to trust, 13 years, fully reconciled. Diane's attorney spent 4 days with the disclosure before scheduling a settlement conference. The settlement conference was held in Raymond Cho's conference room on a Tuesday in December at 10:00 a.m. sharp. Calvin arrived at 9:48 and helped Raymond arrange the documents in precise stacks along his side of the table. He wore the charcoal suit he had bought off the rack 7 years ago and had tailored twice since. He had shined his shoes the night before. He carried the leather folio. He had done this before, sat in conference rooms, reviewed structures, presented findings. He had done it as an attorney, and then as a property owner. And then in this room 7 years ago, when he and Raymond had built the trust documentation that was now sitting in 53 pages on the table between him and the woman he had been married to for 13 years. Diane arrived at 10:04 with her attorney, a man named Harold Sims, who had a reputation as an aggressive litigator and who had, in the weeks since the disclosure, grown noticeably quieter. She sat across from Calvin and looked at the table. She did not look at his face. Harold Sims opened. He acknowledged the trust structure. He noted that Diane was prepared to accept the trust's classification as separate property, contingent on a fair, equitable distribution of the marital assets that remained. Raymond said, "The marital assets are the Buckhead home and the joint accounts. Net equity in the home after mortgage payoff is $312,000. The joint accounts, after the forensic accounting reconciliation, hold $41,700. We are prepared to divide both equitably." Harold Sims said, "My client's contributions to the household economy over 13 years, including significant income from her pharmaceutical sales career, directly enabled Mr. Reeves to manage the trust portfolio full-time. We believe equitable distribution should reflect that contribution." Raymond slid a document across the table. "This is the household income summary for the marriage. Mrs. Reeves's income averaged $186,000 annually. Household expenses, mortgage, taxes, insurance, school fees, operating costs averaged $194,000 annually. The household operated at a modest deficit, which was covered by documented trust loans. Mrs. Reeves's income did not subsidize the trust. The trust subsidized the marriage." Harold Sims looked at the document. "Additionally," Raymond said, passing another sheet, "we are prepared to address the $34,200 in pre-filing withdrawals, which can be offset against Mrs. Reeves's share of the joint account assets. Sheila Park's documentation is attached as Exhibit 3. The room was quiet. Calvin set his pen on the legal pad in front of him. He looked at it. He looked up. Diane was looking at him now, for the first time since she had walked in. Her face was composed, and her posture was controlled, and her hands were still on the table in front of her, and she was looking at him with the specific expression of someone who is finishing a calculation that has come back wrong. He said, without raising his voice, "You knew what I drove. You knew where I bought my suits. You knew I packed my own lunch and drove Ava to school and walked job sites in the dark, because I didn't trust anyone else to catch what needed catching." He paused. "You decided that was everything there was. 13 years, and you never once asked what my grandmother left me. You never asked what the trust said. You never sat in the office on a Sunday and asked what the report showed." He straightened the legal pad. "You built a picture of a man who had nothing worth finding. You were so certain about that picture that you laughed when you handed me the papers." She said nothing. "I'm not going to tell you what the trust is worth because your attorney has the disclosure. You know, what I want you to understand is that the trust is named for a woman who believed that what you build quietly lasts longer than what you announce loudly. She left me one building. I turned it into 14. He picked up his pen. You spent 13 years looking at the Honda and the packed lunch and deciding you already understood the math. You were wrong. You were wrong before you ever started." Harold Sims said. "Mr. Reeves, I'm done," Calvin said. He stood. He adjusted his jacket. He looked at Raymond and said, "I'll be outside." He walked down the hall and took the elevator to the lobby and walked out onto Peachtree Road. It was cold. He stood on the sidewalk and drank from the Stanley thermos, dark roast, no sugar, and looked at the building across the street. It was a 6-story medical office, and he knew the company that owned it, had considered acquiring it 18 months ago, and decided the cap rate wasn't right. The math hadn't worked, so he had moved on. He stood on the sidewalk until Raymond appeared behind him and said, "They're ready to settle on our terms." "All right," Calvin said. "Calvin, I know." She had no idea. "No," he said. She didn't. The settlement was finalized in January. Diane received half the equity in the Buckhead home, $156,000 after the $34,200 withdrawal offset. She received half the remaining joint account balance. She received no portion of the Meredith Ann Reeves Trust. The trust was classified as separate property in its entirety, the loan ledger structure holding completely under Harold Sims's challenge, which Raymond had described afterward as one of the least productive arguments he had encountered in recent practice. Gregory Alston had not returned Diane's last 3 calls by the time the settlement was signed. His attorney had communicated, through the relevant legal channels, that his client denied any knowing involvement in the withdrawal pattern. The investigation did not pursue him further. Once Diane accepted the offset arrangement, he returned the leased BMW to the dealership in February and switched to a certified pre-owned Civic, which he drove to a new position at a pharmaceutical distributor in Marietta, a lateral move that his former colleagues attributed to a sudden interest in a fresh start. Diane sold her portion of the Buckhead equity and moved into a 2-bedroom in a midtown high-rise with a balcony and a view of the skyline that was genuinely impressive, and that she sat looking at some evenings while she drank a glass of wine she had poured too full and thought about. 13 years of Sunday mornings in a house where a man had sat in an office she had never once walked into and run numbers she had never thought to ask about. She tried, on one of those evenings, to remember whether she had ever asked to see the trust documents, whether she had ever looked at the annual accounting summary before signing it, whether she had ever, even once, sat across from Calvin Reeves and asked him to explain what he was building. The answer came back the same way every time she went looking for it. She had not. She had looked at the Honda and the off-the-rack suit and the packed lunch and the man her friends called Practical Calvin. And she had built a picture, and she had lived inside it for 13 years. and she had laughed the morning she handed him the papers because she had been so completely, so entirely, so catastrophically certain about the picture. She did not call him. She had said what she needed to say through attorneys and signed documents, and he had said what he needed to say in Raymond Cho's conference room, and there was nothing left between them that required words. Calvin bought a house in December before the settlement was final. It was a 1958 brick ranch in Druid Hills on a lot with 2 old oaks in the backyard that had been there longer than the house. The floors were original heart pine under 40 years of carpet. He pulled the carpet up himself the first Saturday and stood in the empty rooms, looking at the floors for a long time before he rented the sander. He worked them over 3 weekends, methodical, along the grain, taking his time in the corners, and they came up the color of honey left in a jar on a windowsill. Ava spent 2 of those weekends with him and sat on the kitchen counter eating a sandwich and watching him work and asking questions about the process. Why along the grain, what the different grit levels did, why some boards were darker than others. He answered every question. "How do you know all this?" she asked. "I learned," he said. "From who?" "From doing it wrong first," he said. She considered that. She took another bite of her sandwich. "That's how you learn piano too," she said. "Exactly right," he said. He built a bookshelf for the study himself, the room at the end of the hall with the best light. The room that would be his office. He measured it precisely, cut the wood himself in the garage on a Saturday morning with the cold air coming in under the door, and fitted it along the full south wall of the study from floor to ceiling. He filled the bottom shelves with the history books first. The law books he had kept went on the upper shelves, where he would need to stretch to reach them, but where they would be visible. His grandmother's photograph went on the desk. The same one from the Honda's glove compartment, where he had kept it for years. She was standing in front of the Chambly Tucker building in 1987, the year she bought it. She was not smiling, exactly. She was looking at the camera the way she looked at everything. Directly, without either approval or disapproval, simply noting what was there. He had her eyes. People had told him so his entire life. He understood now what they meant. The Meredith Ann Reeves Trust continued without interruption. The Chambly Tucker building, on its 37th year of continuous operation, produced $9,800 per month in net rent. The 14th property, a small medical office in Decatur that Calvin had been negotiating since August, closed in February. 15 properties. His mother, Eleanor Reeves, came to see the Druid Hills house in January and walked through every room slowly, touching the door frames and the window sills and running her hand along the built-in bookshelf with the expression of a woman who recognized the work. "You built this yourself," she said at the shelf. "Yes, ma'am." She looked at it for a while. "Your grandmother would have approved," she said. "That's what I was aiming for." She sat with him on the back porch in the cold and drank the coffee he had made, and looked at the 2 oaks, which were bare in January but large enough that their branches made a canopy even without leaves, a structure that held even without the surface, without the appearance, from the foundation out. She said, "Did you know?" Before she filed? "I had known for a while." She was quiet. "Why didn't you?" "Because the structure was sound," he said, "and the structure was going to do the work regardless of anything else I did, so I let it." His mother looked at the oaks. She looked at her coffee. She said. She laughed. She stopped, Calvin said. In March, on a Sunday morning, he sat in the office at the end of the hall, with the good light coming through the east window and the heart pine floors running smooth and honey-colored from the doorway to his desk. And he opened the trust management software and reviewed the overnight reports for all 15 properties. Everything was in order. The Chambly Tucker building had sent the rental remittance on time. The Decatur Medical Office had completed its first full occupancy month. 2 properties needed HESVAC inspections scheduled. One property manager had flagged a roof drain issue on the north parapet of the Brookhaven building. He made a note to walk the Brookhaven roof himself on Tuesday. He wanted to see it directly, wanted to know the condition firsthand, wanted to assess the repair from the surface rather than from a photograph. He always liked to see things for himself. He poured the last of the first thermos into the cup and drank it. He refilled the thermos from the carafe. Outside the window, the 2 oaks stood in the yard in the late winter light. No leaves yet, but the full structure visible. The trunk, the canopy, the reach. 30, maybe 40 years of growing. Patient and unhurried and larger than anyone who had not bothered to look would have guessed. He put the cap back on the thermos and opened the property file for the Brookhaven building and began to read. He did not look back. I hope you enjoyed that one. Be sure to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss the next story. I've picked out 2 more for you that I think you'll really like.